Welcome back to, what are we on, Section 3, Ben? ScottCast to Podcast 19. And with me is David Bilka, financial educator and financial advisor. And, you know, David, you and I have talked, you've given me this before, this story actually that happened in your family. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who don't know, David teaches financial success, financial concepts to folks at UCF, I think in adult classes most of the time, right? This is mostly to adults.
And also at Lake Sumter State College as well.
So globally, he teaches, and you've given me this case study before. It's one of the things you lead with in your class, right? To kind of give people a perspective on a real world example. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
So I start my class off with a case study in crisis planning. And, that's the number one mistake that people make when it comes to financial/retirement planning is procrastinating. Putting in, there's always another time to do it. And so this case study is actually within my family, and it's my cousin who went through a pretty traumatic case study. And just a side note, my cousin is an engineer and an MBA, and his wife's a CPA, so they're very
smart
competent people.
Yes.
And what happened is, I don't know if it's a regional thing, a generational thing. I'm from Ohio originally, and his parents shared next to nothing about their financial life for most of his life until they had to, because the crisis hit. And the crisis was my uncle, who should have been in a long-term care setting already, but his wife took care of him as long as she could. He was going to assisted living, and then my aunt was going to have open heart surgery. And both of these events were going to happen in a matter of weeks. And they sat down with my cousin and they said, hey, we need your help. Not sure what to do, and we need your help with everything. And so my cousin dove through his parents' archives, and what he found were several things. One, he found a life insurance policy that his dad purchased, 30, 40 years ago, that there was no beneficiary named in the life insurance policy. So what I posed to my class is, well, what would happen what happens to a life insurance policy if there's no beneficiary named? And I get a whole range of answers. I know you know the answer, Scott, so I don't know if I should just answer it.
Yeah, answer, please. Okay. I'm on the edge of my seat here.
So, what happens is, it's not, some people answer, the state keeps your money or the insurance company keeps your money. And then, no, that's not that, that gloom and doom. But what happens is the insurance company will make every good faith effort to, go through the process.
Pay somebody.
Right. And it has to go through probate then. To figure out where the life insurance, the death benefit goes, it goes through probate, which is completely unnecessary. It will absorb 3 to 8% of the asset, depending on the state and on the circumstances. Simply naming beneficiaries, if it's done properly, all they need is a death certificate in the state of Florida. It's a long form because it issues the cause of death, and they need the beneficiaries to sign a claim form, and it's it. It's pretty simple. But he discovered that. So if my uncle would have passed without him correcting it, then his mother would have been months before she would have received the funds, and then she would have lost some of it due to going through probate. The second thing he discovered, because he didn't know how his parents invested, was they really weren't investors. They were savers actually, but they weren't investors. Mm-hmm. And the distinction is he discovered virtually all their money was in CDs. Now, this was several years ago when CDs were paying slightly better than they are now, but really not much. Mm-hmm. And so the problem with CDs, what have they averaged the last 20 years, maybe?
A little more than doodly squat.
Yeah. So you're not, to keep up with inflation, basically general rising cost of living, you're looking at anywhere between 2 and 3%.
Right.
And I don't think the CDs were even matching that. I know at least not the last 5-10 years they haven't. So his parents could have actually, because they were quite disciplined savers, They could have been millionaires. They could have been like the millionaire next door, that book right there on the table.
Sure.
But they weren't, because their money was not in appreciating assets. It was in, quote, safe asset, which were CDs.
Right.
And the mistake his parents were making, and, of course, in an educational format, I ask questions rather than, just say it. But the question is, okay, why would they put their money consistently in CDs? And in their minds, they were being safe.
Sure.
And what they, what they didn't understand was, by being too, quote, safe, being too conservative when you're retired, or in any stage of life, but especially when you're retired, that's actually going to be more likely you're going to run out of money than if you would have invested some of that money.
Right, because you can't keep up with the cost of living increases that, when you buy milk and bread and
exactly
things.
The third thing he discovered was they did have estate planning, but it was over 30 years ago, and and they just had a will. They didn't have powers of attorney, which a power of attorney is a financial power that you grant to someone else, and it's normally only used in the event that if someone is becomes sick or incapacitated. Well, here's my uncle who had Parkinson's is going into assisted living, so you look at it this way too: is retirement accounts can only be in one person's name. It's an individual retirement account. A 401k can only be in one person's name. There's no such thing as a joint 401k or IRA. So if in the event my uncle or my aunt, who's now going to open heart surgery, if in the event they could not get access, they were alive, but their loved one could not have anything to do with their account without that document. The custodian's not even permitted to answer even what the account balance is without that document. So that was something that he discovered was missing. He also discovered that they had no long-term care insurance or plan. Mm-hmm. And so when he asked his parents, by this point, of course, they're not insurable way beyond that, why didn't you ever look into that? And they said, well, we did, but it was too expensive. And so then he thought, well, his father started at $7,000 a month because he had Parkinson's. So it was, he went from 7 to his second. He lived 2 years in long-term care. The first year he was spending about $7,000 a month, and then his last year he had to go to a nursing home because his Parkinson's had advanced, and he was basically $10,000 a month for his last year.
So how expensive was that?
Right. So that was the things he discovered, and he had weeks to deal with it.
Yeah. And
I really felt for him because he called me because I do this for a living, and I helped him as much as I could. And in the end, he found an elder care attorney in town because they had to set it up. They wanted to get too much in the weeds here, but they were trying to set it up where Dad could qualify for Medicaid, and they had to do a whole bunch of things to do that.
Sure.
And he thought initially that everything that was presented to him, well, he's kind of an alpha male or an alpha person, engineer, I'll respect engineer.
Yeah.
My son's studying engineering at UCF right now. But he thought he could handle it. Hey, my wife's a CPA, I'm an engineer, I'm an MBA. What's it to it?
Yep.
And he said he was the most overwhelmed he ever was in his life. And the money he spent, and I didn't charge him anything, but the money he spent on getting this all set up, he said was the best investment he ever made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's planning is hard. You and I have talked about this before. It's a discipline. It requires effort. It also requires a conversation that's likely uncomfortable because you're dealing with mortality and health issues. And to sit here as a healthy person and say, well, I'm fine. Why would I do this? There's going to come a day. That's how the system works, or doesn't, as it were, is that as you age, things become more difficult. Underwriting for long-term care is an example. If you think long-term care is important, I happen to think there is a range that it's important. If you're worth $1 zillion, well, you probably don't need long-term care. If you're dirt poor, then you're going to end up in the system anyway. But for a lot of us, there's a middle ground, right? And for the mass affluent, which I would say people with assets between $700,000 or $800,000 and $10 million, maybe $6 or $7 million. it's a real asset eater if you're not careful. So to have an uncomfortable conversation with your spouse, with your adult children about, look, I probably need to get long-term care now at age 58 or 62 because at 72 I'm going to have something. And whatever that something is going to make it cost a whole lot more. But you said, well, his quote was it was too expensive, right? Which would have meant, I'm going to guess premium on average for average retirees $3,000, $5,000, $7,000 a year, and it isn't cheap. But it's way better than $7,000 or $10,000 a month.
Right.
And that is a burden. And it is also what I've witnessed in my clients is that it also makes it difficult on the adult children because they're saying, look, we have this finite pot of money, 200, 800, 300, whatever the number is. We have to make this last. What if this person lives in care? Some people with dementia live in care for 10, 12 years. We have to make it last, which means they might go, well, we'd like to put them in the really awesome place, but we may not be able to afford that for 10 years, so we got to put them in the less than awesome place.
Right.
And is that really a conversation you want to have? So I think your example is wonderful, and if you open somebody's eyes up to this early in life, and they do some planning, and I will say, you said they did some planning and it was 30 years ago. I would recommend updating a little more frequently than every 30 years. I would say it's something I personally look at mine every 5 years. I don't know, does that seem reasonable to you?
You're talking about your estate planning?
My personal trust.
Absolutely, yes.
And looking at my coverages and sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes you meet a client and they're 68 years old and they've got $2 million in assets and their kids are all grown and successful and they're paying $20,000 a year for an insurance policy. And you're like, I don't think you need that anymore. So again, generalizations here, but it goes both ways. It's not just how can I spend more money. Sometimes it's can I spend less money.
Sure.
So I think this is a wonderful example. And how do the young people or even older people, how do they respond when they hear something like this?
I get a lot of, you just described what happened to me. My parents were the same way. They didn't share much of anything. I see people, it's almost like I'm at a religious ceremony.
Yeah.
People start nodding their heads, people have gotten choked up in the middle of me telling the story because, they just recently lost a parent or something and they went through, and also they had settling an estate. Talk about have no idea what you're doing.
It's ugly. And it's a bad time.
Yes. And your mind's in a fog, and you off people, and when you talk about just a side example would be a beneficiary or inherited IRA. When I talk about that in the class, and I'll explain the options people have with it, and that's changed with the Secure Act, so that recently changed, but there still are options.
Sure.
And I'll get examples where people say, gosh, I wish I would have known about my options before my mom or dad died, because I went to the bank or whatever institution it was, and they told me I had to liquidate the account. And that actually is not accurate. So that's where, back to, again, we all have to plan. It's just a question of, do you do it when you're comfortable, when there's not a crisis, when you can think things through and get professional guidance, or do you do it when the crisis hits? Because you are going to plan.
Somewhere.
At some point.
Yeah, and do you do it when you're of calm mind? And it's just like your homework. You want to procrastinate and cram it all in at the last minute, but the difference being, it's you're dealing with a death generally, or somebody becoming incapacitated, which is stressful in and of itself, and it's hard to make good decisions when you're under that kind of emotional stress. So it's nice to just have a track to run on. All right, we've already got this, and this. Yes, there's going to be loose ends no matter what you do, but had there been long-term care, had the planning been done, and the will and the preparation for Medicaid participation, it probably would have been a lot less stressful for your cousin in this instance.
Yes, and then back to the class and clients where feedback is, well, I want to set it up so my kids don't go through what I went through.
Yeah, and you hear that a lot.
Yeah.
You want to give your kid or your adult children. I did long-term care for my wife and I recently, when I guess I was probably about 52 at the time, and I thought, I'm going to do this because I've watched clients go through this two different ways. The first way is your cousin's route, which is brutal to watch and destroys assets, to be candid with you. I mean, if you're the heir to a $800,000 nest egg, but you spend $700 of it on care when insurance could have covered that. Again, money's not the primary issue in this instance, but it's still a little aggravating to have to watch that capital go away. So I think this is a wonderful case study, and everybody can learn something from it. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Scott.
It's been very helpful to, I think, anybody who watches this. It's been podcast number 19, ScottCast, the podcast number 19. Vinny's agreeing with me. Yes, I think that's right. So thank you again, and thank you, everybody, for checking us out.